Okay, good morning and good afternoon for everyone joining this session that we are having. Um, this is an international SDG network project that we are joining together with our partner from Norway and from our partner from Turkey, basically from the Norwegian University of Life Science and from the Bursa de Lac University and the Catholic University as well. And we are planning to share what we are doing in our project that started in August 2024, being the leader who is talking to you, Dr. Germán Merino, and with me is our co-leader, Dr. Margareth OVERLAND, who is going to be our first speaker today. And also our next co-leader is Dr. Nessie Camille, who will be the speaker for the next session that will be on November. Basically, for today, we call it this a graduate workshop because we wanted to share with our graduate students, but also could be undergrad students to be joining, and as well our researcher teams can join as well. And we call this webinar the Science for Achieving Sustainable Development of Biointegrated Aquaculture Production Systems. This is a web seminar that we call it number 1. We have 4 speakers today, Dr. Margareth OVERLAND, three speakers, Dr. Sergio Rocha, who will be giving choose to talk, and Dr. Byron Morales Lynch. And next meeting will be for you to put in your schedule will be on November 19. We were having two speakers for that day, Dr. Camilo with us today, and Dr. Gray Felix. And the last one will be on December the 17th. On that time, we were going to have 4 speeches. So after that, I would like just to give the word to Dr. Margareth OVERLAND. The talk will be about 45 minutes. Then we will have 10 minutes for questions, if there is any. And then we start with our next presentation. All right. So I'm letting you to start, Dr. OVERLAND.
Thank you. Let's see. You will stop sharing first. Then I will load up my my file.
Yes. All right. Let me. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So do you see this all right?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you very much for that introduction. And I should start this a little bit about saying telling you who I am, because yes, I am a professor in aquaculture nutrition, and my research focuses on circular proteins ingredients. And I am a team leader of a center called Fruits of Norway, where we are developing local feed ingredients from underutilized biomass by use of biorefinery processing. And we also work with immunonutrition, where we use functional feed to improve health and robustness of the fish. But today, I will talk about one of the most, I would say maybe one of the largest challenges we have in aquaculture. How can we feed the fish in a sustainable way? And to answer this question, we first need to know what the fish actually need. And knowing the protein requirement of the fish is the foundation for developing sustainable feed. And in the lecture today, I will begin with a short background about the challenges that we have in the aquaculture industry. And I will focus on the salmon industry mainly. And then I will move on to why protein and amino acids are so important for fish nutrition. Next, I will look at methods how to determine the protein and amino acid requirement in fish and how we assess the protein quality of these feedstuffs. And from there, we will discuss how we can formulate feeds to meet this requirement, as well as what are the limitations to the current feeds and why we need to look ahead towards a more circular, resource-smart feed system. And then finally, I would like to share some research highlights from our own work on novel protein ingredients. So yes, with that, let's get started. So, as you know, today the aquaculture industry is the fastest growing food sector in the world and is playing an important or increasingly important role in meeting the global protein supply. And Norway and Chile have specialized in salmon, and salmon industry has become a success is history or story, I would say. But along with that, there are also several challenges that we need to solve. And one of the main challenges is limited access to sustainable, high quality feed ingredients. And then you also have large problems with pollution, leading to large environmental impact. And another serious problem is the high mortality rate that we're facing. And in Norway alone, we're losing about 50 million fish at least every year during the seawater period. So this is not just a question about economy, but it also raises questions about sustainability, animal welfare, and the repetition of the salmon industry. So in order to solve these challenges, we need to develop feed solutions that not only provide a high growth rate, but also those that can improve fish health and reduce the environmental impact. But in this lecture, the focus is on protein because this is I would say maybe the most important input factor in the fish feed. So let's go into discussing why protein is so important. Because feed makes up about half of the total cost in salmon farming. And here, protein is the largest, makes up the largest part of the feed. And it's also the most expensive. And it counts for about 50 to 60% of the total value. And let me see here. And this is why it's so important that when you formulate the feed, it should provide enough protein to cover the needs for the growth. But you don't want to overfeed because what happens then is that excess protein is broken down and used as energy, and then the nitrogen is lost as ammonia, and that actually leads to an environmental impact. But traditionally, the fish were fed fish meal as the main protein source. But today there's not enough fish in the ocean to cover this need. But the fish doesn't really need fish meal or fish to grow. But what they do need is a range of essential nutrients. This includes amino acids, fatty acids, some carbohydrates, vitamin and minerals. And this can be provided by a wide range of different feed raw material. But this limited access to this fish meal has resulted in a large shift in the composition of the diet of the fish and towards more use of plant ingredients. So now the quality of the ingredients become more variable, and that can be a problem in formulating the diets. But we will get back to that later. But in order to feed the fish more efficiently, we need to know what nutrients do these raw material contain, how digestible are they, and how well are they utilized by the fish. And here the goal is to reach the right balance, because if you feed too little protein or the wrong amino acid profile, it's gonna result in reduced growth performance. But if you feed too much protein, you'll have higher cost and more nitrogen is wasted, and this leads to an environmental impact. So basically, when you look at the protein requirement of the fish, they have a much higher protein requirement than these terrestrial animals, such as pigs or chicken, typically about 2 to 4 times higher. And there's also large differences among the protein requirement from the different fish species. But having said that, the fish are a lot more efficient in converting the protein from the diet into edible tissue. And this is because they are hydrothermic, because they don't need to use energy to maintain a constant body temperature. And they live in the water, so they need less energy to support their body weight. And also they require less energy in order to move around in the water column. And they don't really need a strong skeleton. That means also they have a higher fillet yield. And they also have a lower requirement for reproduction because they produce a lot of offsprings compared to the land animals. So you need fewer breeding animals. But it is important to realize that not all fish are the same because this, you could say the requirement varies depending on the species, but also from their trophic level. Because some fish are carnivorous and they're evolved by eating other fish, whereas other fish species are more plant eaters. So they evolve from eating all kinds of plant ingredients. But here you can see how large this variation can be among the different fish species. But I would say even though there is some indication about the requirement of the different species, still there's a lot of information we still don't know. And that makes it a little harder to optimize the different feeds. So why do we require protein, or why do the fish require protein? Well, the protein is essential for many body function, and this includes the need for growth and development, tissue repair, and for maintenance in order to actually keep the fish alive and healthy. And protein is involved in many important vital body function. This includes the enzyme for digestion and metabolism purposes, hormones for growth and reproduction, transporter proteins such as hemoglobins, immune molecules such as antibodies, and other vital metabolites. But it, it also is used for energy sources. It might not be the primary function, but it can also be used for energy sources, especially when the carbohydrate content and the fat content in the diets are limited. So basically, the take-home message when you formulate diets to ensure optimal growth, health, and performance, diet must contain enough protein to meet all these different needs. So the protein requirement of the fish. When you formulate diets, we need then to know the content of the protein in the raw material. We need to know how well they're digested. And then we need to also know how well they're utilized in the body. But when you look at all these different criteria, the protein digestibility is actually the major factor in affecting the protein requirement of the fish. So if the protein is not well digested, it will have a large impact on the protein needed in the diet in order to meet the requirement. So before we get into the protein requirement, we should take a look at and review how the protein is digested and what happens after the protein and amino acids are absorbed by the fish. When you look at the digestive tract of the different fish species, there are large differences between the different species, whether you are carnivorous or a omnivorous fish. And in Atlantic salmon, the digestive tract consists of the mouth, the stomach, the pyloric region, and then a short intestine. And in fact, the intestine is about 0.8 times the fish body length. But that also means that there are smaller surfaces for digestion and absorption. And the salmon has a fast passage rate, which means there are less time for digestive processes. That means that the salmon requires a very high quality diet. And also, the fish has limited capacity to digest starch because of a low alpha amylase activity. And also, they have a low microbial population. Therefore, they are not very well adapted to utilize these complex carbohydrates. But when you look at the tilapia, which is an omnivorous fish, their body length is about 5 to 8 times their fish size. That means that they have a slower passage rate and they have a much larger absorptive area for digestion and absorption of the nutrients. And they are better adapted to low quality diet. And they also have a larger microbial population, so they are able to convert these fibers and complex carbohydrates into volatile fatty acids that are then used as energy source. In addition, these Omnivores fish are often kept in warmer waters, so their enzyme activities is also very high compared to the salmon. So this has a large impact on how you formulate the diets for the different fish species. Now let's look at the digestive process. And when it comes to protein, it's very dynamic. First, the protein are broken down to smaller peptides and amino acids by different peptidases and proteases, so they can be absorbed in the intestine. And the digestive process starts in the stomach under low pH condition, where pepsin breaks down the protein into smaller peptides. This enters then the pyloric region, where you have a higher pH. And here, the digesta is mixed with bicarbonate, bile acids, and digestive enzymes. And here, enzymes such as trypsin, chymotrypsin, and various peptidases will break down these peptides into smaller peptides or individual amino acids. These are then taken up in the small intestine by the epithelial cells, where they might be broken down further into individual amino acids by brush butter enzymes. And then finally, they are absorbed either by active absorption or passive absorption into the bloodstream. After the amino acids are absorbed, they are transported to the liver through the portal vein. And from here, they enter the body pool of amino acids, where they can either be used for protein synthesis in various organs or tissue to support growth and maintenance. But proteins are not stored in the body like carbohydrates or fat, but instead you have a continuous turnover, where they are either broken down to amino acids and resynthesized and used to build new proteins, or they are converted into other biological important molecules. But when the amino acids are in excess or not needed for protein synthesis, they can be catabolized and used for energy or converted to glucose or lipids for energy storage. And when you look at the salmon, it has a large capacity to utilize amino acids as a glucose source. Then the amino acids are deaminated and they are then converted into glucose and ammonia. The excess ammonia is then either excreted through the gills or the urea cycle. But the urea cycle is quite limited in the salmon. So about 80% of this ammonia is actually excreted through the gills. Now we can go further and look into the protein requirement of the fish. But in reality, fish don't really need protein itself to grow, but they need a well-balanced mixture of essential and non-essential amino acids. And the protein synthesis requires about 20 to 22 different amino acids. 10 of them are considered essential, and meaning that the fish cannot make them themselves, but they need to get them through the feed. And then you have 10 that are non-essential, meaning that the fish can actually produce enough of these to support growth. And some of them are also considered semi-essential because they can be made from the fish if their precursors are provided and if a sufficient amount of precursors are provided through the diet. For instance, cystins can be made from methionine. So if you provide enough cysteine in the diet, you actually can reduce the requirement for methionine. The same goes for tyrosine and phenylalanine. But fish also need a minimum amount of non-essential amino acids to support an optimal protein synthesis for growth. And ideally, this ratio between essential and non-essential amino acids should be around 50 to 50. But normally, if you formulate a diet to meet the protein requirement and the requirement of essential amino acids, these needs for non-essential amino acids are also met. But when you look at the protein requirement, it's also important to realize that some of these amino acids have roles beyond optimal growth because they support immune function osmoregulation, antioxidation, neurotransmission, and other important roles. And examples are arginine, histidine, tryptophan, and taurine. So when you formulate the diets, you must also take the needs for these additional functions into account. To grow, the fish need a constant supply of amino acids from the diet because the protein synthesis can only occur if all the non-essential and essential and semi-essential amino acids are present. And also protein growth requires the right amino acid that they are present at the right amount at the right time compared to the requirement. And if there is too little of just one essential amino acids, the protein synthesis will stop. And these amino acids that are then unused are then broken down to energy or used for other function. And the amino acid requirement can be illustrated by the so-called rain barrel concept. In this concept, the barrel represent protein growth, and each stave represent the requirement for an individual amino acid. That means that you can only fill the barrel to the level of the shortest stave. If one stave is shorter than the other, the water will start leaking. So, in other words, if only one amino acid is limited, the protein synthesis will stop, and the unused amino acids are broken down for energy, which means that you have less efficient use of your protein. And now we will go on to evaluate the protein requirement of the fish. And when you look at the protein requirement, fish mainly require protein and amino acids for growth and maintenance. So to formulate the feeds to meet these requirements, we must first define the overall requirement for these two items. This is done by determining the total requirement for both maintenance and production. And the maintenance requirement is the minimum protein required to keep the fish alive and healthy. And this refers to the amount of protein and essential amino acids needed to replace losses, which includes the losses from the gut after meal, or amino acids that are lost through body turnover or oxidation, or amino acids that are lost through skin and scale, or those that are used for synthesis of non-protein products. And to determine the maintenance requirement, there are two different main methods that are used. This is either a direct method, which involves measuring nitrogen balance in fasting fish, where the total nitrogen losses from feces, urine, skin, and gills are then measured. And then the maintenance requirement is then calculated as the amount of protein or amino acid needed to replace these total losses. And these experiments are often done in metabolic tanks, which allow for the collection of ammonia that are lost then in the gills and urine. But you can also measure it indirectly. But this is based on nitrogen retention that is measured during a dose response trial when the fish are fed increasing level of the protein or amino acid in question. And then the maintenance requirement is determined as the protein intake at the point where the fish is neither gaining weight or losing weight. That is when the weight gain is actually zero. When it comes to the protein requirement or an amino acid requirement for growth, the common method used here is called the dose response trial. In these studies, the fish are fed diets with different level of proteins or amino acids, and then we measure their growth responses. And then the protein requirement is then defined as the minimum level that result in the best growth. And the same, of course, then applies to the individual amino acids. So to run these trials, the fish are then fed a basic diet with a balanced amino acid content, except for the one amino acid in question. Then you have test diets that are made by adding increasing amount of the specific amino acids from below requirement to above requirement. And in these trials, we're often using 6 different levels in order to see a clear response. And then, as you can see, as the amino acid level increases, the growth rate improves until it reaches a level, forming a plateau. And this plateau is often referred as a breakdown, and this defines then the requirement. And then in order to identify exactly where the requirement is, they're often using regression models, such as a broken line analysis, to find this exact value. And these dose response are often based on growth performance, but this criteria is not always sensitive enough. So this is often combined with other type of criteria, such as feed conversion ratio, or by measuring blood chemistry, such as the amino acid in the blood or blood urea nitrogen. And often they're also combined with nitrogen balance study, where you can also take into account nitrogen or amino acid requirement to obtain maximum amino acid retention or nitrogen retention. And again, this is either based on the direct method or indirect method based on slaughter technique, which is the amount of nitrogen retained in the body during the experimental period, during optimal growth. So basically, once you know the maintenance requirement and the requirement for growth performance, the factorial method is based on a step-by-step determination on how much of the protein and amino acids are required for maintenance, growth, and other physiological function. So then the total requirement is the sum of the protein or amino acids used for growth and maintenance, and it includes catabolic losses and those that are lost in the feces. And this factorial method takes into account the maintenance need of the fish, the protein needed for optimal growth, and it also takes into account the efficiency of how well the protein and amino acids are utilized. And it also takes into account additional amount needed for other function beyond growth, such as, well, the requirement to cover stress responses or immune responses. But this method does have certain limitation, because for many fish species, we still don't have precise information about the maintenance requirement. So that's one of the limitation. And the other issue is that this method assumed that there is no interaction between amino acids or other nutrients, and that they are used with equal efficiency, independent on age of the fish, health, or an environmental condition. And another problem is that these trials are often very costly, time-consuming, and that can result in variation among different studies. And there are also dietary factors that affect the results, because this results depends on the energy content of the feed, because that affects how well the protein is utilized and how much the fish is actually eating. The other thing is the quality of the protein used in the reference diet. What is the amino acid profile, and what is the digestibility of protein used? And that has an impact on the requirement. You will, for instance, obtain different results whether you're feeding a high-quality fish meal diet or plant-based diet. Then you have the taste of the feed. If you use a poor tasting diet, you're going to have a lower feed intake, and that again affects the growth. and that will also have an impact on the outcome. And then you have the biological factor that affects the requirement. And it includes the size and age of the fish, the water quality, the temperature of the water, the stocking density, stress, disease outbreaks. All of this can then affect the protein or amino acid requirement. But what's happening right now in recent years is that there has been improvement to this method that makes it more precise. So they're now developing more modern factorial models that includes both of these dietary and biological factors. And this allows us to formulate diet more accurately for specific conditions where the fish are raised. So with this, you can improve the growth performance of the fish. The feed ingredients are used more efficiently, and you also end up reducing cost and you lower the environmental impact. So altogether, this makes aquaculture more sustainable. But now I would like to present another concept, and that is the ideal protein concept. And this concept is originate from pig nutrition, and it has now in the recent years been adapted for fish. And the basic idea behind the ideal protein concept is that dietary amino acid requirement of the fish should be a mirror image of the amino acid pattern in the fish muscle. So in other words, if you want to formulate the diet that matches the amino acid composition of the fish, that is basically what you want, because then you actually are feeding the fish what they actually need. So in practice, what this means is that we express the requirement of each essential amino acid relative to lysine, which is then set to 100. And that's because lysine is often the most abundant essential amino acid in salmonids, but also often the first limiting amino acid in the feeds. But of course, if the diet is very high in protein, methionine could also, in some cases, be the first limiting amino acids. But this concept, with this, it means that once you know the requirement of lysine, you can then calculate the requirement of the other 9 essential amino acids on the basis of their ratio relative to lysine, which is set to 100. And this allows us to formulate a balanced diet, even though we don't know exact requirement for every single amino acid. And this concept can also be used when you want to evaluate the quality of the feed ingredients, because then we can see how well the feed ingredient matches the amino acid requirement of the fish. So if the diet is close to the ideal amino acid profile, the fish will use the protein more efficiently, which then will lead to reduced nitrogen excretion and lowers the environmental impact, and it decreases the cost of the feed. But of course, there are some limitations also to this method, because the retention between the amino acids might differ. So some are overestimated and some are underestimated using this method. And the method doesn't fully take into account maintenance requirement, which will change as the fish grow. But it's still considered a powerful tool, but it's not completely perfect. So overall, the ideal protein concept helps us feed the fish more efficiently, reduce waste, and improve the sustainability and the profitability of the aquaculture. But when the ideal protein composition can be performed either by analyzing the whole fish or the fillet of the fish. But you have to keep in mind that the amino acid composition differ between the different species. So you need to use the composition for that specific species. But if you don't have this information, often high quality fish meal is also used as a basis. So once you know the nutritional requirement of the fish, in this case, the requirement for a digestible protein, the next step is to formulate the diet with the right balance between digestible protein and digestible energy, the so-called DPDE ratio. So why is this important? Well, the thing is, if we provide enough energy in the diet relative to the protein, the fish can use the energy for the basic metabolic need, where the protein is then used for growth and protein deposition, which is what we want. But if you don't have enough energy, the fish will start breaking down the protein and use it as an energy source. And this, of course, is inefficient and costly and leads to increased environmental input. But as the fish grow, the protein requirement actually decreases with increasing body size. And for the same reason, the DE/DP ratio in the diet will also increase as the fish get larger. And this is reflected in the body composition of the fish. And here you can see as the fish grow, the protein content relative to the fat content goes down. So you have to adjust the diet accordingly, which means that you have to lower the DPDE ratio for larger fish. So now, when we understand why DPDE ratio is so important, the next question is, how do we determine the right ratio for the fish? That means that we need to know two things. We need to know the digestibility protein requirement of a fish for a given size. But we also need to know the content of digestible protein and energy in the feed raw material. And once we know this, then we can formulate the diet that provides both enough energy relative to protein to meet the requirement. So basically, here you can see the ratio between digestible protein and digestible energy in salmon, and you can see how this changes from juvenile salmon to a larger salmon, ranging from 19 to 24 gram DP per megajoule DE to about 16 to 70 gram. So there's a large span here. So next topic to discuss is how to evaluate the protein quality of the feed ingredients. Once you know the nutrient requirement of the fish to formulate the diet, you also need to know the nutritional quality of the feed raw material and how suitable they are in the fish feed. But that means we need to know what nutrients do they contain and how much. And we also need to know how palatable is the feed. Do they influence the technical quality of feed? And how well are these nutrients absorbed? Do they contain any anti-nutritional factors that can affect their utilization? Do they have any contaminants? Or do they affect immunity or health of the fish? As you know, overstimulating of the immune system can be costly and can affect the requirement. So, therefore, health of the fish needs to be considered. How do they affect the sensory quality of the final fish product? So to start with, we need to characterize the fish ingredients in terms of nutritional content. So that means we have to do a chemical analysis to look at what do they contain in terms of protein, amino acids, fiber, fat, fatty acids, and then we need to identify anti-nutritional factors or contaminants. And this step is the foundation of the nutritional content in the ingredient. And then we need to know the palatability. Will the fish actually eat the diet? Because poor palatability will reduce feed intake and performance, even though the ingredient might be of high nutritional quality. And then the next step is the digestibility. So how much of the protein can be broken down and absorbed by the fish? And this is crucial in order to determine the actual nutritional value of the ingredient. And the next step is that we need to know the utilization. How much of the absorbed nutrients can actually be used for growth and maintenance? And this step is important because it evaluates the biological value of the protein. But in recent years, there's been a growing focus on evaluating how these feed ingredients affects the immune responses and the overall robustness of the fish. And here, this is determined by looking at the immunomodulating effect of the ingredients or perform pathogen challenge test. And then we also need to know about the functionality. How do these ingredients behave during feed processing? Do they affect the technical quality of the feed? And then at last, do they have an impact on the protein quality? So by knowing all this, the feed formulator can make a better decision on how much and how best to include this ingredient in the diet. So these are all very important aspects. And the next question when you formulate the diet to meet the protein amino acid requirement is how do you formulate the diet to meet the daily requirement of the fish? Because this requirement is often expressed as milligram per gram of digestible or milligram digestible amino acid per kilo body weight. So that means in order to formulate diets, you not only need to know the content of digestible amino acids and protein, you also need to know the optimal DPD ratio and the ideal protein profile. But you also need to know the feed intake of the fish. And feed intake is often expressed as percent of body weight. So once you know the amount of feed that the fish eat, then the next step is to calculate the concentration of the amino acids or protein that's needed in the diet to meet the requirement. And then the final step is to formulate the diet to meet the daily requirement. When you look at the protein requirement of the fish, the official requirement is actually published in the NRC or the National Research Council requirement from way back when in 2011. And these are still the official requirement. And they are often used as a starting point, but they have many limitations because they're very old and they're not really well defined for salmon. A lot of these requirements are based on rainbow trout. And the other thing is that they are not relevant for the modern genotype. Their experiments are often performed on juvenile salmon, which is not so relevant for the fish during the grow-out stage. And these initial experiments were done on a high-quality fish meal-based diet, but they're not very relevant for the plant ingredients that we're using today. And they're also based on growth rate, but they don't take into account metabolic need and the fact that the fish require amino acids beyond the growth for such as immune function and stress. But today, the industry has developed their own internal nutrition requirement database. And this is based on extensive in-house research trials, field performance data from commercial farms, published information from the literature, or they're using precision nutrition model. And these databases are more dynamic and they take into account differences in performance and fish health and product quality under the specific rearing condition. But they also take into account environmental regulation, sustainable certification, and consumer-driven demand. And I don't know how much time I have, but I would just also wanted to mention that when you feed the fish to meet the requirement, this used to be simple. During the time when the diets were based on the fish meal and fish oil, because the fish meal is highly nutrition and it has a very stable protein content and it has an excellent amino acid profile. Therefore, it's easy to use when formulating these diets. And these ingredients also have high content omega-3 fatty acids, and they're rich in essential macronutrients such as iodine, taurine, and hydroxyproline. And they don't have any anti-nutritional factors, and they are highly digestibility. And and formulating diets based on fish meal was relatively simple, but now fish meal is becoming more limited, and this has led to major changes in how we feed and formulate the feeds in the direction of using more plant ingredients, which are more variable, and they contain anti-nutritional factors that has an impact on how well they're utilized. So I don't know if I have much time to go further here, because this changes in the feed formulation from fish meal based to plant ingredients will have a huge impact on how to formulate the diets.
You have 10 more minutes, so you can do it.
Oh, okay. Um, So moving away from the fish meal diets to the plant, well, plants have many advantages. They're abundant and cheap, and they reduce the reliance of fish meal, but they are more variable, and they do result in the different challenges when formulating the diets. Um, they have a lower nutrient content, and they have lower protein density, so that you need higher inclusion rate. Often they're imbalanced amino acid profiles, and they have a high content of fiber. They're poorly digested, and they have these anti-nutritional factors that can influence not only nutrient digestion and absorption, but also their utilization. So there are some issues that needs to be considered. So basically, um, the situation in Norway is that our diet has now shifted from being fish meal based. Today they contain about 72% plant ingredients. And a large proportion of this is made out of soybean meal. But other types of plant raw materials are also used. The situation in Norway is also that 92% of the feed ingredients are imported from other parts of the world. And the feed account for about 75% of the footprint in salmon aquaculture. And this is largely linked to the large proportion of imported feed ingredients. So we need to think about how we feed the fish in the future. And to increase feed security, to meet our climate goal, we need to produce more of the feed ingredients locally. And we need to reduce the environmental footprint of the salmon production, which means that we need to do something about the feed. So recognizing this, our government has now put the sustainable feed ingredients on the political agenda. The goal is that all fish feed should come from sustainable sources by year 2030. And they also want that the local feeds should make up about 25% of the total feed. Today, they only make up 8%. So this, to meet this requirement of the fish, means that we have to move from a linear value chains to circular solution. These are solutions that minimize waste and allow nutrients to be recycled back into the food chain. And this is really what we're doing in Foodstore Norway. We're using circular feed ingredients, such as insects, such as microbes, that actually allows us to be able to recycle the nutrients that are lost into a feed system back into the feed system, because they can convert organic side streams and underutilized biomass into high valuable protein sources or fat sources that can be used from the aqua feeds, making this aqua feeds more sustainable. And if you want to read more about the circularity, I would suggest that you look into this paper that was recently published by Glenn Cross and co-authors. So with that, in order to allow some time for questions, I think I might just stop right there.
Thank you, Dr. Margaret. So now that we have a few minutes for questions, if anyone from the audience would like to do it.
I have a question, Herman.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Camille.
Okay. Hola, buenos días. Hello for everyone. Uh, Hello, Margaret. First of all, thank you again, as always, for your detailed and well-prepared presentation. I have a question about the protein types. Um, how would you interpret, with precise figures, the differences in effective amino acids profiles between plant-based and animal-based proteins?